Someone can pay more than $1,000 just to have Christmas lights put on their house. And that immediately got my attention. Because unlike most businesses, Christmas light installers only have a small part of the year to make most of their money. But some professional installations can cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars. And one large Christmas decorating franchise reported average annual gross revenue of roughly $400,000. One reported location was doing more than $5 million in gross revenue, which made me wonder, how does something this seasonal become that big? And more importantly, could an ordinary person actually make serious money doing it? So I decided to start with one house. A $1,500 house would obviously be interesting, but I wanted something closer to the middle. So I used a $1,200 installation. $1,200. One customer, one Christmas display. My first question was simple. How much of that $1,200 does the installer actually keep? At first, the business looked almost ridiculously simple. Imagine doing 10 $1,200 houses. That's $12,000 in revenue, 25 houses, $30,000, 50, $60,000. And all of that happens inside a relatively short season. So, I could understand why people describe this as a business where you might make a large amount of money in just a few months. My first assumption was that the economics had to be good. The customer pays a large invoice, the work looks straightforward, and the demand arrives at almost exactly the same time every year. But there was an obvious problem with my calculation. I was multiplying revenue, not profit. Before I could figure out what was actually left, I needed to know what the customer was really paying for. The first thing I checked was whether $1,200 was even a realistic invoice. And it was. For the residential display size I modeled, professional pricing can land around $750 on the low end, about $1,200 in the middle, and roughly $1,800 toward the higher end. More elaborate properties can go higher still. So the surprising part wasn't that a homeowner might pay $1,200. They can. And once I looked at larger companies, the revenue ceiling became even stranger. Reported franchise figures from Christmas Decor showed average gross revenue at roughly $399,993. Basically, $400,000. And the highest reported location was above $5.8 million in gross revenue. But I had to stop myself there. That's revenue, not profit. A $5 million company can still have millions of dollars leaving through wages, materials, vehicles, marketing, storage, insurance, and overhead. So the big revenue figures answered one question, but created a better one. People clearly pay serious money for professional Christmas displays. But what exactly are they paying for? Because if the entire service was just someone climbing a ladder for an afternoon, $1,200 would look incredible. I soon realized that wasn't the right way to think about the job. I originally imagined the homeowner buying the lights, then paying someone to put them up. But professional full-service companies can work differently. The company can supply the commercial grade lights. That immediately creates a material cost. Then someone has to install them. That creates labor, and depending on the job, one person may not be enough. So now there's helper labor too. Then I noticed something I hadn't really thought about. The job doesn't necessarily end when the lights turn on. If part of the display fails during the season, the company may need to return and fix it. Now the invoice also needs to support maintenance. And after Christmas, someone has to climb back onto the house, take everything down, organize it, and potentially store it until next season. Removal by itself can carry market value in the hundreds of dollars. So I crossed out my first description of the business. This wasn't get paid to hang lights. A full-service customer could be buying the lights, the design, the installation, maintenance, removal, and storage, which meant I'd been looking at the wrong job. $1,200 wasn't payment for one afternoon. It was revenue supporting an entire seasonal service. And now that I knew what that $1,200 had to pay for, I could finally start subtracting. We start with $1,200. That's the easy number. Now, the business has to supply the display. In my base model, the customer-specific lighting and material allocation is about $188. $1,200 becomes $1,012. Then I need a helper. Using the labor assumptions in the model, helper labor costs about $137. Now we're at $875. Already more than $300 has disappeared. But we still haven't found the customer. That's easy to forget. The customer doesn't magically appear at the front door asking to hand us $1,200. Advertising costs money. Under my base customer acquisition assumption, getting one booked customer costs about $108. So $875 becomes $767, then transportation. About $60 allocated to the job. We're at $707. Clips, small hardware, and consumables, another $30, $677. Then I need an allowance for maintenance or a return visit. $50, $627. Storage, insurance, and other variable overhead, another $60. Now, $567. And this is where a lot of small business calculations become misleading, because I still haven't paid the owner. If I do the work myself, my time isn't free just because I own the company. So the model charges $180 for the owner's labor, and suddenly the $1,200 job becomes approximately $388 of economic profit, about 32%. That's still profitable. But it's very different from the number I started with. $1,200 came into the business. Only about $388 remained as economic profit after the modeled costs and owner labor. And once I saw that, I wanted to know something else. What happens if the installer tries to win customers by charging less? So I rebuilt the exact same idea using a $750 customer. And this is where the business became much more interesting. Revenue, $750. Materials, minus $150. Helper, labor, minus $137. Customer acquisition, minus $108. Transport, minus $60. Hardware, minus $30. Maintenance, minus $40. Overhead, minus $45. Owner labor, minus $180. What's left? Approximately $0 of economic profit. That surprised me, because nothing about this job looks like a failed business from the outside. The customer paid $750. The company generated revenue. The owner worked. The helper worked. The house got decorated. The customer might be perfectly happy. The calendar might even look full, but once the business pays every modeled cost, including the owner's time, there's basically nothing left. That's when I wrote something down that I think matters far beyond Christmas lights. Busy doesn't automatically mean profitable. And suddenly discounting looked much more dangerous. A company could fill its entire Christmas calendar with the wrong customers. So naturally, I tried the other direction. What if instead of $750, the customer pays $1,800 for the premium model, $1,800 of revenue. Materials minus $300. Helper, labor minus $182. Acquisition minus $108. Transport minus $70. Hardware minus $40. Maintenance minus $60. Overhead minus $90. Owner labor minus $240. That leaves approximately $710 of economic profit. Now, the three customers look completely different. $750 revenue, roughly zero economic profit. $1,200, about $388. $1,800, about $710. Same general business, very different result. So price clearly matters, but while looking at all three scenarios, one number kept bothering me. customer acquisition. Every calculation assumed I had already found someone willing to hire me, and finding them wasn't free. What happens if that one number gets worse? The home service advertising benchmarks I used showed paid leads in comparable categories ranging from roughly $47 to around $118 per lead. For my base model, I used a $54 lead and assumed half of those leads actually became paying customers. 2 leads to get 1 booking. That's about $108 to acquire a customer. It's already included in the $1,200 model. But then I tested a worst case. What if competition increases and a lead costs $118? And instead of converting half, only 35% become customers? Now, 1 booked customer costs roughly $337. Remember our base job? It produced around $388 of economic profit with the original acquisition cost. Replace the $108 acquisition cost with roughly $337, and economic profit falls toward $159. Same house, same $1,200 invoice, same lights, same installation. Almost nothing changed in the service, but the business became dramatically weaker because the customer became expensive. That was the moment I stopped thinking the job started when the van arrived. The job starts when the company tries to find someone to buy it. But even that isn't the first dollar the owner spends, because before customer number 1, the business needs equipment. The startup range in the research came to roughly $3,000 to $10,000 for a basic setup. Lights, ladders, clips, cords, timers, safety equipment, storage equipment, tools, and other starting inventory. So I took the $388 base economic profit and asked how many customers it would take to recover that money. At a $3,000 startup, roughly 8 base case jobs. At $10,000, roughly 26 jobs. So, before I start talking about making a year's income, I may need somewhere around 8 to 26 profitable base case customers just to economically recover my initial setup. And then I noticed the biggest constraint in the whole business. I can buy more lights, I can buy more ladders, I can spend more on advertising, but I can't buy more December. Christmas doesn't move. If I lose an installation day, I can't simply replace it in February. The customer doesn't want Christmas lights in February, so the calendar itself becomes capacity. Suddenly, the question isn't, how many customers can I sell? It's, how many profitable customers can I actually complete before the window closes? And while looking at that problem, I finally noticed something that changed the entire investigation. All the way through this, I had been asking, how profitable is one Christmas light installation? But a full-service company can remove the customer's lights, store them, and potentially reinstall the system next Christmas, which means the first year creates more than one invoice. It can create a returning customer. In the base model, roughly $108 was tied to acquiring the customer, and around $188 was tied to the lighting and material allocation. That's almost $300 connected to establishing that first-year relationship in the model. I don't have a universal year 2 profit number, and I'm not going to invent one, but the structure clearly changes if the customer returns. The company already knows the house. The display has already been designed, the relationship already exists, and the lighting system may already be sitting in storage. That's when I crossed out value of one installation and replaced it with value of one customer. Maybe the real asset isn't the Christmas lights. Maybe it's the customer list next Christmas. And if that's true, then I needed to test this business in 3 completely different ways: as a weekend side hustle, as full-time seasonal work, and as a company with employees. First, the weekend version. Let's say I can complete 2 base case jobs per week for 8 installation weeks. That's 16 customers at roughly $388 of economic profit per base job. That's around $6,200 of seasonal economic profit. Now, $6,200 is real money as additional seasonal income. That's interesting, but it's nowhere close to replacing a full year's salary. So, under this model, the weekend version works much better as a side hustle than as some shortcut to instant wealth. Then I tried the full time version, 8 base case jobs per week for 10 weeks. That's 80 jobs. Under the approved model, roughly $31,000 of seasonal economic profit. Now we're talking about much more meaningful money. But I also have a much bigger operation, 80 installations, 80 customer schedules, potential service calls, later, 80 removals, storage, weather problems, advertising, and all of it compressed around the same holiday. So the money improved, but so did the operational pressure. And $31,000 of modeled economic profit is still not automatically a full year's income. The headline was starting to look possible only under very specific conditions: higher prices, more capacity, returning customers, or a larger organization, which led me to the final model. Now I stopped doing every installation myself. 2 crews, 5 jobs per crew per week for 10 weeks. That gives us 100 jobs. At $1,200 of base revenue per job, that's approximately $120,000 of seasonal revenue. But this is exactly where bad scale math becomes dangerous. I cannot just take the profit from one owner-operated job, multiply it by 100, and call that company profit. The cost structure changes. Employees replace owner labor. There may be additional vehicles, more storage, more sales and administration, more scheduling, more insurance, more customer acquisition. Under the approved scalable model, the estimate lands around $35,000 to $45,000 before additional fixed and administrative costs. So, yes, the business can scale, but scaling does not magically remove the costs. It introduces new ones. And then I went back to the large company numbers. Average reported gross revenue around $400,000. One reported location above 5.8 million. That tells me the ceiling can clearly move far beyond one person with a ladder. But those numbers still don't tell me what the owner keeps. And by this point, I think that's the most important habit in this entire episode. Whenever someone shows me revenue, I want to know what survives. So, would I start a Christmas light installation business? Here's how the numbers look to me. Startup cost, roughly $3,000 to $10,000 for the basic model we researched. Profit potential per modeled job at $750, approximately zero economic profit. At $1,200, around $388. At $1,800, around $710. Finding customers. My base model used about $108 per booked customer. In the bad acquisition case, that rose to roughly $337, and the base economic profit dropped to toward $159. Break even on startup. Roughly 8 to 26 profitable base case jobs, depending on the initial setup. Weekend side hustle. About $6,200 of seasonal economic profit, under the 16 job model. Full-time seasonal operator, around $31,000, under the 80 job model. Scalable company, 100 modeled jobs, around $120,000 in seasonal revenue, with roughly $35,000 to $45,000 in modeled profit before additional fixed and administrative costs. So, my overall verdict is yes, this is a real business, and under the right conditions, it can be a good one. But the reason isn't that people pay a ridiculous amount of money to hang Christmas lights. The business becomes interesting when the price is high enough. Customer acquisition stays controlled. The calendar is used efficiently, and customers return. Fill the calendar with $750 jobs, and you can work extremely hard for very little economic profit. Spend too much acquiring customers, and a profitable house becomes mediocre without anything changing on the roof. And if you try to scale, you have to build an actual company, not just multiply one good job. When I started this, I was staring at the invoice, $1,200 for Christmas lights. That sounded like the opportunity. Now, I think the invoice might be one of the least interesting numbers because the real questions are underneath it. How much does it cost to deliver? How much does it cost to find the customer? How many profitable installations fit inside the season? And does the customer come back? That's the part I hadn't considered. I thought this was a business about decorating houses. Now I think it might be a business about building a group of customers who call you every December. Maybe the real asset isn't the lights. Maybe it's next Christmas's customer list. And that left me with another question. Christmas lights have an obvious problem, the calendar. There's only a small window to make the money, but that same limitation seems to create the opportunity. So now I'm wondering, what other ordinary business completely changes when the calendar becomes the constraint?